You argue against heavy regulation to foster innovation. So I have a feeling you're not pro a patchwork approach, but will we ever get a federal approach, or at least Congress being able to push forward one?
Yeah, so I think the executive order that you mentioned earlier by President Trump was in one part trying to get some of that done without congressional action. That's probably not going to be a very successful plan. But I think also part of it was trying to create some political pressure for Congress to take on this responsibility and act in place of, as you described, a patchwork of 50 state regulations. There were 1,000 of them introduced or passed or considered just last year, and often they're contradictory, often they're heavy-handed. Some of them might make sense, but not all of them do. And to ask U.S. AI entrepreneurs to operate in that environment is very unrealistic.
Well, what's interesting is even despite that executive order, many California lawmakers are still pushing ahead with some of their AI regulation. And then I think what other Senate Commerce Committee chair, for example, you've had Ted Cruz roll out a package of AI-related legislation. He's doing that back in September. You've had Marsha Blackburn looking to unveil more potential regulation. That was announced in December. There's been Democrats in the House as well, Jessica. What is the most sensible?
I think we'll start with what's the least sensible, which is that the default situation if Congress does nothing is that you're going to have the most strict regulatory regime. So think California, think New York, become the default setting for the entire country, right? As firms try to comply with this, the big ones might have the money to do that, but smaller guys are going to say, okay, we're just going to comply with the most strict version and hope that gets us through. So, that's not how any of this was designed to work. And what you need is people on the national stage. That's why we have the Commerce Clause, willing to butt heads, even if they disagree. That's what hearings in regular order are for. So the Ted Cruzes and the Marsha Blackburns should talk this out and figure out where we can get to some agreement on this. But this certainly is the purview of Congress and not just the most regulatory strict states or 50 different states.
Now, in many ways, AI czar David Sachs has been thinking about federal regulation from an administration perspective, but also they've been thinking about how some of the innovations in the US are enabled to be sent abroad. And we still think about what NVIDIA and its access to China really looks like. How much is that going to be dominating the agenda as well, from your perspective?
I think chips are a part of it, but I think that you correctly identified the issue that looms largest in this debate is that, this really isn't a domestic question so much as we are, in fact, in a race with China for global AI dominance. That's just the reality. I think people who are looking at this on that scale understand that tying an arm behind a back with a bunch of state regulations for the U.S. is not a great plan for winning. So I think all of those questions, whether it's chip restriction exports or creating a regulatory regime, as we see in the EU, they have an AI regulatory regime that's bigger than their AI sector. We don't want to fall into that trap because this isn't just about benefits to U.S. consumers, which there are many from AI, and the health of our economy, which is significant from AI. But it really is also making sure that as we go forward, the world is running on U.S. AI, not Chinese AI. That's been our approach in a lot of technological times of innovation, but it's certainly never been more important than it is with artificial intelligence.
Some of the angles with artificial intelligence has been mental health and security of its users and consumers. This is something that we think time and time again has been affecting the social media outlook. There has been a void of federal regulation when it comes to the protection of users on social media. Over in Australia, you've seen quite drastic steps being taken by looking to disallow anyone younger than 16 using companies, Meta with Instagram, with Facebook and the like. What do you make of what Australia's done and what we might do in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, Australia is certainly like the first mover in this, right? It's out on the tip of the spear. I'm not sure it's going to be the silver bullet for everyone's mental health and all the things that make being a teenager difficult that they hope it is. But they're willing to run the experiment for us. And I'm sure that other countries are watching closely and there might be some copycatting there. I think that's a much steeper hill to climb in the U.S. First of all, we have the First Amendment. That would be a challenge for a law like this. Kids don't have full rights as adults, but they have some rights. And also these social media companies have their own First Amendment rights to speech. So that also we have a Congress that, it often struggles to get so-called must-pass legislation done. So I think it's two different environments. We'll all be watching how it goes in Australia. So far, it's a lot of kids circumventing the rules with VPNs and other tactics. But and the fact is, too, these social media companies that are targeted by the laws are born and bred in the U.S. So it's a little bit different politically as well. These are our companies, and as we talk about all the time, these are creating a lot of wealth and value for consumers here. And I think we think a little more carefully about how we treat them and what regulations and fines we subject them to than the rest of the world does.